In this segment, we look at some popular Buddhist devotional practices. Rosaries or prayer beads are used in many traditions to count one's repetitions of a prayer or a mantra. Another central practice in most schools is chanting. One can chant alone and one can chant in groups. Very often one is chanting one of the popular Mahayana sutras. Scholar Donald Lopez, in his book The Story of Buddhism, says this, quote, "It is important to bear in mind that the vast majority of Buddhists across Asia have been illiterate. Thus, it is misleading to think of the Buddhist books solely as something to be read. Sutras were placed on altars and worshipped with offerings of flowers and incense, as the sutra itself often prescribed. Lay people sought to accrue merit and avert misfortune by paying monks to come into their homes and chant sutras. Regardless of whether the audience or the reader could understand the content, the word of the Buddha was being heard, and this carried the power of a magic spell." End quote. And a little bit later he observes, quote, "Indeed, in Tibet, at the time of the New Year, or in the case of natural disasters such as droughts, it was common for the monks of a monastery to read the entire portion of the canon considered to be the word of the Buddha, traditionally contained in 108 volumes. In this massive undertaking, the volumes of the collection were divided among as many monks as possible, who simultaneously read each page aloud, creating a cacophony of the Dharma. As an additional blessing, the volumes were then carried in a procession around the village." End quote. And one of the most popular Mahayana sutras to chant is one we discussed in the last lecture, the Heart Sutra. We discussed it as a piece of Buddhist philosophy, but in many different kinds of Buddhism, it's used in various ceremonies for its power, including ceremonies designed to placate evil spirits. A devotional practice you find in Northern Buddhism is the use of prayer wheels. A prayer wheel is a cylinder which can easily be spun around. They come in all sizes. The handhold ones are popular. You can see that she has one in her hand right here. She just has to kind of shake that and it'll spin round and round and round. And then here is a large prayer wheel at this temple that she's visiting. Inscribed on the outside of the prayer wheel is a prayer or mantra, something that's going to have some powerful effect if you say it. And spinning the disc is considered equivalent to saying it. So this lady has just walked down a whole row of them and spun them all with her hand as she's walked past. Another practice is hearing a Dharma talk. This is basically a Buddhist sermon in which a monk or some other teacher expounds on some aspect of Buddhist teaching and exhorts and encourages the listeners to double down their efforts in their practice. Relics have always played a role in Buddhist practice. Since Gautama's death, bits of his remains have been worshipped in stupas, which we discussed before. These large kind of dome-like monuments that you circumambulate, that you walk around. Every temple has a stupa, some small and some really enormous. They don't all have relics nowadays because there's only so many relics to go around, but at the beginning they did. The devotee comes into the temple, circles the stupa 3 times, then bows, kneels, or prostrates themselves to it. This is a way of making merit. As we've seen in the Zen school in Japan, which is related to the Chan school in China, in those schools, meditation is a really central practice, especially sitting meditation. But there are many kinds of meditation. We've also discussed deity meditation and meditating on dead bodies in the burial grounds, and also remembrance of the Buddha meditation where one visualizes being in the presence of the historical Buddha and hearing him teach. American scholar Stephen Prothero observes this, quote, "Although Buddhism is widely associated in the West with meditation, most Buddhists do not meditate. Their piety consists largely of bhakti-style devotion to various Buddhas and other super-mundane figures. They worship these Buddhas in temples, pray to them at home, and go on pilgrimage to sacred sites associated with their exploits. Buddhism also plays the leading role in funerary rites in almost every society where it has a major presence. Because this tradition is associated with rebirth, families look to Buddhist monks when it comes to dying, funerals, and memorials." End quote. Then again, in modernistic Buddhism and Buddhism as practiced outside of Asia, meditation very often is the central practice. They don't have these other societal traditions, and some of them really don't focus on anything beyond this life. as we mentioned before. In our next segment, we'll talk about Buddhist use of images, pilgrimage, and other aspects of their practice.